Can I say at the outset that I think this type of legislation is welcome, and I agree with almost everything that Senator Loughlin said in her speech introducing the bill to the House, and I commend her and her colleagues in bringing it forward. It is, as Senator Norris has said, timely. It is also necessary, regrettably, and a number of senators have recounted the stories that many of us will be aware of, and famous cases like that of Declan Flynn, where the most appalling injustice for absolutely nonsensical and incomprehensible reasons have been committed against people in this state, and we do have to deal with that, there's no doubt about it. Senator Loughlin also referred to the commitment to the programme for government, which I personally think was very welcome, and it came not just from the programme for government, but because a number of members of these houses over the years have called for exactly this type of legislation, have called for action in this area. Specifically, the programme for government says that hate speech and hate crimes have a particularly lifelong impact on individuals and communities and have no place in our society. And Senator Loughlin dealt with this, and I think Senator Chambers also made reference to it. The impact on a victim in circumstances where the victim not just of a crime, but of crime because of some aspect of their person, be it their ethnicity or their sexual orientation, or indeed their gender, I know that I'll come to that in a second, or the other issues that are mentioned in this bill, it is entirely understandable why that would have such an incredibly pervasive effect on them and the people around them. And the damage it does is largely incalculable for those of us who are outside that particular offence. So there is no doubt whatsoever that, as Senator Loughlin says, the legislature must recognise the seriousness of that added element to an offence. Specifically, the programme for government says that hate crime legislation will be introduced within 12 months, and it will specifically create offences to ensure that those who target victims because of their association with a particular identity characteristic are identified as perpetrators of hate crime. And I think that's a tremendously important statement. I understand, and we will obviously hear from the Minister in due course, but I understand from Minister McEntee that is coming and that legislation is in train. There was a public consultation on the issue that was commenced by the former Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan, in this regard, I think sometime late last year. I understand that is now complete and that the results of that public consultation are likely to be published before Christmas, and that new legislation, I hope we will see officially from the government in the new year, but I don't know any of the details of that. However, I think it's important that we as a House acknowledge the importance of legislation and the importance of making a statement in law that the state will not accept this kind of behaviour. I don't agree with what Senator Norris has said about there being no hate crimes legislation. There is, of course, the Prohibition on Incitement to Hatred Act from 1989, and the cases he mentioned, I don't know if they predated the operation of that legislation or not, but for example, the reference he made to the periodical in Galway, which made homophobic comments or articles, I mean, that is not acceptable and it is not lawful. And specifically in Section 2 of the 1989 Act, it says that it shall be an offence for a person to publish or distribute written material, to use words, behave or display written material, or to distribute that written material if it has words, behaviour, visual images or sounds, as the case may be, that are threatening, abusive or insulting and are intended or having regard to all the circumstances are likely to stir up hatred. So there is some legislation there, but it's clearly inadequate because it hasn't addressed so many of the cases that we've heard about in the course of this debate already. And I think everybody in this House would want to ensure that we do have the legislation and that both the Gardaí and the prosecutorial authorities have the instruments that they need to effect prosecutions in this regard. The other piece of legislation is the Equal Status Act, which I think it's important to have reference to because that identifies 9 specific grounds in which it is unlawful to discriminate against people. And all of them are legitimate and important aspects of the law that protect minorities and indeed a majority in our society in terms of the gender aspect of it. It's important to recognise that while equal status legislation is tremendously important, it is civil legislation. It doesn't create a criminal offence, and that obviously creates a difficulty from the point of view of laying down a standard for prosecution in terms of these matters. So I take on board what is said in this legislation, and as I say, I welcome the legislation. I do have some difficulties. Senator Norris identified one of them being the subjectivity of the offence that's mentioned in the Section 1 interpretation. I think it's tremendously important when we're drafting criminal justice legislation, that we have regard to the possibility for something to be twisted. There is, for example, hate crime legislation in the United Kingdom, which is quite strong, and it provides for a mandatory increase in a sentencing regime for a judge if, in the process of that prosecution, there is a connection with some element of the kind of things that this bill is talking about, some hate crime element to it. Unfortunately, that was twisted in one case that I'm aware of, where the person being arrested for an entirely unrelated offence, so an offence that had nothing to do with hate crime, then accused the arresting officer of being Welsh. Now, whether or not the officer was Welsh, I don't know. Whether or not describing somebody as Welsh constitutes a hate crime or not, I don't know. And this is a story I'm aware of because of my brother-in-law who's Welsh, who told me the story. But the difficulty is with loose drafting, you create possibilities like that. And that makes a nonsense of the importance of this legislation, the notion that something like that would add on a mandatory component to sentencing. So we have to be tremendously important. And the difficulty I have in terms of that definition section is the perception issue, that a hate crime includes any offence that is perceived by a victim or any other person to be wholly or partially motivated by prejudice against a relevant individual. I also acknowledge in raising this issue that Senator Loughlin herself has said that there are imperfections in the bill, as there are in every piece of legislation. But that is something that I think we would have to address at the next stage if this legislation is to pass forward. Equally, I think the definition of homophobia is difficult. It says it includes negative and uninformed feelings towards homosexuality, as if to suggest that had they been informed, it wouldn't be homophobia. But of course, but again, these are things that we could tease out at committee stage if and when the bill gets to that stage. I think it's tremendously important, however, to also bear in mind the fact that the bill in sections 2 and 3 deals with sentencing and aggravating factors in sentencing being related to hate crime. Hate speech, hate offences, anything that is clearly connected to hate is already an aggravating factor, and every judge in this country would take that on board. So it's tremendously important not to send out the message that that is in any way acceptable. Judges already increase sentencing tariffs. But finally, I'd say, Cathaoirleach, that in respect of the schedule to the bill creating a provision whereby a maximum sentence would have to be handed down, I think that is problematic. And I think that I would generally be opposed to the fettering of judicial discretion in terms of sentencing, which is tremendously important. But I welcome the legislation. It's problematic, but I think that could